Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Tonight, my guest is a Republican primary candidate for Washington State's 3rd Congressional District, Joe Kent. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a policy on this show of only having on candidates who are in races that can definitely be won, and that's one of the reasons I'm having you on, because a Republican currently does represent your district and has for 10 years. It's within not a super close percentage point either, so this is definitely a winnable district. So first of all, why are you running, and why are you running in a Republican primary to try to oust the current Republican occupant of that seat?
So I'm running against Jamie Herrera Butler, who was one of the 10 representatives who voted for the impeachment of President Trump. She went one step further and offered to be the Democrats' star witness in the Senate impeachment trial based on third-hand information that never really came to fruition because she was greatly exaggerating her claims. But it's not just that. So this is kind of a straw that broke the camel's back. For far too long, Representative Butler's been like a lot of establishment Republicans where they like to talk a big game about all the things they're going to do while they're in the minority to raise money and to boost their status. But then once they were in the majority and we actually had a president in who wanted to push America first agenda items, she and many other Republicans didn't back the president at key times. So she voted to withdraw the emergency declaration on the construction of the border wall. So we can see right now with the border crisis, how big of a consequential vote that was that she made. She also went against the president on repealing and replacing Obamacare. So and that's affected the economy and so many personal lives of individuals in my district. And the list goes on. So this was just kind of a catalyst that led us to rise up as a district and seek out a different voice in Washington, D.C.
And I've noticed from the data I looked at for her seat, she's definitely been getting smaller and smaller margins over the last couple of years. In 2016, it was 61 to 32, and now fast forward 52 to 47. Why do you think that gap closed? Because she was in a very safe Republican district, and now it seems like your district may be trending a different way.
So I don't think it's necessarily that the district is trending in a different way. I think that she just lost a lot of enthusiasm. So we're located between Portland and Olympia and Seattle. The 3rd district is one of the only red districts that touches the Pacific Ocean. So we're the only red district in the continental United States that touches the Pacific Ocean. So we are contested ground. The Democrats do want to take it very badly, but people over the years, as Representative Butler wouldn't stand up for our values and wouldn't come back to the district and hear from people as much. There just wasn't as much enthusiasm. So I think the old logic of never going after an incumbent, I think that logic is old and tired, and we need to actually challenge these incumbents that have done nothing for us.
And what is your background? Why do you feel that you're qualified to represent the district? And why do you feel you're qualified to address the local issues the district might be facing in jobs or COVID recovery?
So I spent over 20 years in the United States Army. So I was started out as a enlisted guy in the Ranger Regiment and then went to Special Forces. And the second half of my career, I was a warrant officer. So that's a subject matter expert in special operations. So my job was to bridge the divide essentially between labor and management. And I think that ties in very nicely with being a congressional representative. So my job is to work with every local person in my district and then represent their voices back to Washington, D.C. So this is what I did in the military for 20 plus years, usually under extremely stressful environments like war. I did 11 combat deployments as a combat leader, where my job was to put together diverse teams and make them all work towards a common objective. And then also, I feel what the left is doing right now to America is a complex information networked attack. And they have every element of society essentially working in their favor. They have the media, they have the school education system, and now they have full control of the government. They took that by, I think, relatively sketchy means, but with the election fraud that went on this last year. And now they're moving in full lockstep to try and codify that and to make that the law. So in special operations, our job was to look at these complex networks and then break them down. So I can see how all of this is interconnected, especially with the COVID lockdowns, how that ties into HR 1 and wanting to normalize election fraud essentially by federalizing our elections, and then how that ties into all of Joe Biden's economic policies that hurt working class Americans, but also hurt our national security by making us dependent on foreign oil, by shipping our economy back overseas. So I see how all these things are tied together, and I want to take the skills that I learned in special operations and go to DC and fight back.
One thing I found interesting is you spent a lot of time in Portland. You know that area very well. For a lot of conservatives, it's been a very big uphill battle to explain to the rest of the country the horror that has gone on in a lot of these cities that have been really taken over by a very militarized, I guess you could call it, social justice group. And there's been a difficulty in explaining that this is going to happen in other areas, that this is not going to be contained to Portland or to New York. So how do you plan to explain to people, if you were on the national stage, what has happened in Portland? The fact that it's not necessarily a good place to be raising your family, even if you're just an independent person.
Right. So what's happened in Portland, I think, is the full display of the way the left has infiltrated all of our institutions, and then also our society's sense-making organism, the media. So societies figure out what's going on based on the media and based on the education system. And long ago, the left, years ago, put in a good deal of radicalized teachers that have been indoctrinating students with this far left ideology. And then the media comes in as that other check to say, hey, if you don't subscribe to this far left ideology, you're a racist, you're a bigot, and we'll come after you. And we saw how they came after President Trump, but then also came after Parler with deplatforming. So there's consequences for it. So in Portland, I think it's what's very frightening is Antifa and violent actors have exploited people's desire and really wanting to be tolerant and live by the left's ideologies. And so Antifa's come in and said, if you don't support us, then you're a Nazi, you're a radical. And so people obviously are, very worried about being labeled that, because, these are good people in their hearts. They're like, I don't want to be racist. So I'm going to go along with what Antifa is saying, even though I don't necessarily agree with the violence, but then violence gets a momentum of its own. And especially when the police departments won't go in and actually arrest people and then press charges against them, it just continues to spread. And the thing is, the left knows this. So like I said, this is a networked attack by the left. We know that every element of the left has done nothing but encourage the lawlessness in Portland and Seattle. So these guys, Antifa, BLM, they're the left's proxies. They can have enough disassociation from them to say that, any of the violence they do, we don't have anything to do with that, but we agree with their social justice message. Well, that's all just a narrative the media is pushing so that they can, at times when it works out to their benefit, they can have entire cities burned, like we saw for the last over a year now at this point.
Yes, and I think that's an important point because everyone running for Congress has to be prepared to explain what not having any Republican control in government is ultimately going to lead to, especially on a local level. And, going into 2022, obviously a lot of people want to have Trump's endorsement when they're running in these seats, especially there's, congressional seats, the Alaska Senate seat. Why do you think you should have Trump's endorsement? And do you think that it matters to have Trump's endorsement in these seats that are definitely winnable for Republicans?
First and foremost, I think it definitely matters. I think we need to have President Trump kind of weigh in and endorse candidates that are going to push forward the America First agenda. So I'm an America First Republican because I lived through our endless wars and I became an America First Republican by seeing the uniparty, both the Republicans and the Democrats, keep us at war for no clear national security objective. When they lied about it for regime change wars, when they lied about it for the Iraq war, that made us more vulnerable, while at the same time they were shipping our economy overseas. And the establishment, both the Republicans and the Democrats, were the ones that were benefiting from this. So I've seen them do this from the inside, essentially, and I'm willing to go fight against it. So unfortunately, I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of failed policy. My wife was also in the military. She was killed in Syria a month after President Trump tried to get us out of Syria because we had achieved our military objective and Trump was trying to get us out, fulfilling his campaign promise and doing the right thing. So after that happened, I began speaking out as much as possible because the mainstream media and the establishment was really trying to brand Trump as a fool and saying that he didn't know what he was doing with foreign policy. Well, I have 20 years of foreign policy expertise from fighting these wars at every level. And so from my perspective, President Trump was spot on and we had the data to support it. So after my wife was killed, despite all the personal grief I was going through, I really felt that it was my duty to go out as much as I could on the media, write op-eds in defense of President Trump's foreign policy. So I worked in that capacity pretty much up until the election of 2020. I was even considered for a position in the second Trump administration in the national security realm. So I'm very well versed in the America First message with my background. But then also I do plan on earning President Trump's endorsement by outworking my competition, by going to every event, any place I get invited in my district, and just listening to people and getting out and listening to people. I've heard that the America First agenda is what people want. And they also they don't want to just let the events of November 2020 die on the vine. People want fighters that are going to go forth and fight for election integrity. That's first and foremost on everyone's mind. People from completely different walks of life, they keep saying that to me. So I want to push forward based on my past record of America First, but then also with what I'm doing right now, how I'm performing as a candidate. That's why I feel like I'm going to earn the Trump endorsement.
And I think for a lot of establishment Republicans, they may say, oh, well, Trump candidates, they're two in this area, they're two in that area. But I actually think you're inoculated against a lot of that, because you can say what's happened in foreign policy. And I am, as a voter, tired of the left picking people that are inoculated against certain criticisms. No one's really going to be able, with a straight face, to be able to call you a traitor or to say you're treasonous. So that's not really going to be a thing that can happen. But are you receiving pushback from establishment Republicans, who I know a lot of them are not happy about the challenges to this seat? They feel that it's a winnable seat they don't need to be paying attention to. Are you seeing that establishment pushback in your district or through the Republican grapevine?
I've heard some stuff here and there in the grapevine. However, what the good news out of the third congressional district is we've had 3 of our major counties Republican committees formally censure Jamie Herrera Butler, saying that, hey, you will not be our candidate. So that's really good news. And then everywhere I go, I mean, people are still flying their Trump flags. The base is still fired up about what happened. And I think the message that the base is sending right now to even establishment Republicans who might not like what they're saying, but the base is saying basically, if we don't pick America First candidates, like, we are not going to come out. So that's, I think, the warning. And this isn't, it's not a threat of any kind. It's just, it's a fact. If we don't pick America First candidates to go after people like Jamie Herrera Butler, to go after these rhinos, the base is just not going to come out. So I think this is a time to get unified behind the America First agenda. So I've been actually pretty happy with the message I've received from the Republican Party here in the 3rd District.
And do you think that the Republican field for 2022, what do you see as the major issue aside from election integrity? Because there are so many different things Biden is pushing right now. It kind of seems like his administration does not have a clear idea of what even their main topics are, aside from infrastructure. Right. So what do you think is the common thread between 2022 Republican congressional primary candidates?
So like you said, election integrity is absolutely huge, but the America First agenda really is the agenda of the working and the middle class. So everything that Biden is doing right now across the board, it targets the working and the middle class. The immigration crisis on our border, it's obvious that that's a security crisis because the cartels are controlling the flow. These South American countries, they're not sending all of their best people. So there is a very huge security issue there, but there's a major economic issue. All of these illegal immigrants that are getting pumped into the country are going to take jobs from hardworking Americans that should be filling those jobs. The major corporations, the same corporations that benefit from COVID lockdowns because they haven't missed a paycheck or a day of work, like Amazon and Walmart, they don't plan on hiring hardworking Americans because that's going to cost them too much money. They're going to undercut by hiring all these illegal immigrants. So the corporations are still benefiting from Joe Biden. The corporations are benefiting from illegal immigration, but the American working class remain locked down. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, Joe Biden said if we were all good, maybe we could go back to normal on the 4th of July. And then they backpedal when the CDC director comes back out and says, oh no, there's a whatever 4th wave at this point. We might have to lock back down. So all of that is targeting the American working class. And then the Keystone, killing off the Keystone pipeline is huge too, because that's increased not just everybody's cost at the pump, but that every price of every commodity is going up. And that, again, that just targets the working class. So I think the America First message is that we are the new party of the working and the middle class. We want to liberate Americans from the shackles of government. We want to open the economy back up. We want to secure our country by onshoring our infrastructure, which creates more jobs, makes us safe from another pandemic or anything else that China has up their sleeves. And then also it helps us end our endless wars by bringing back fuel stability and energy independence back to the United States. So just across the board, we are the party of the working and the middle class. I think that's our message.
And in 2020, that kind of got muddled a little bit. There was a lot thrown back and forth, not always even a clear idea of what we were running on from the Republican Party, the RNC. And one of the things we suffered from was this narrative that Trump was incompetent in foreign policy. This went on from the very beginning. We had people resign. I read one of your op-eds and you wrote that Jim Mattis resigned in protest after one of Trump's Syria withdrawals, and this set off a series of high-profile resignations and more private, bureaucratic, slow roll of Trump's orders. This is a narrative that has really hurt the Republican Party, especially with suburban voters, that Trump didn't know what he was doing with the military. Do you feel that you can explain on a national level or a state level to the American people that he did, and sort of pop this bubble that has surrounded him and really his foreign policy accomplishments of what he was doing with Syria? Because there's still a lot of confusion with Republicans who want to support him, but felt like he didn't even have the support of generals.
I mean, Syria is a great example. So we went into Syria under the Obama administration because ISIS had drastically expanded, taken over large swaths of Syria. They were creating an immigration crisis into Europe, but then there was also enough ground for for ISIS to hold to plan external attacks. So it was a clear and present threat to the United States of America and most of the free world. So it was clear that we had to go take out ISIS. President Obama, because he supported the withdrawal of troops from Iraq, he wanted to really underplay how dangerous ISIS was. He called them the JV team.
Yeah.
He launched a very, very poorly orchestrated campaign to try and get rid of ISIS early on. I was deployed as a Green Beret during that time. We were essentially in Iraq and in Syria trying to push together partner forces, but the partner forces that we had were not the right ones. They were the Iraqi military, and the Iraqi military had pretty much crumbled under ISIS initially, the one that we trained for trillions of US dollars during the Iraq war proper.
Yeah.
And the new Iraqi military was all Shia militants that were supported by Iran heavily, but we were having to use them to go fight ISIS. And we didn't really have clear guidance on how we could decisively use combat power under Obama. Trump came in and he identified a problem. He said, ISIS is a problem, and I'm going to give the military the longitude they need to go and decisively crush ISIS. Don't ask me for permission, just go get it done, was Trump's message. So we went back over there. We destroyed the territorial caliphate, which was the best that we could do. So extremist ideology is deep rooted, and we can't take it out with the military. If we could have, the war on terror would have been over a long time ago. But what we can do is we can deprive terrorists of sanctuary. And that's exactly what President Trump did with his counter ISIS campaign. So we went in and we destroyed the territorial caliphate in Iraq and then in Syria. And when we reached that objective, President Trump did what no other president has done in my lifetime. So since 9/11, we've had these lofty objectives that never really seemed to find a finish line. So we went into Afghanistan to get rid of Al-Qaeda when they attacked us. The second Al-Qaeda moved into Pakistan, we took a big time out and said, hey, the whole mission's changed, and now we're going to build a government in Afghanistan. Well, that's not what the American people signed up for.
Right.
That's not what even the legal document, the authorization to use of military force, covers. And then we went into the Iraq war, which we all found out later was launched completely on lies, but we got bogged down there into a complex insurgency that one of our huge enemies, Iran, benefited from. So Trump did the right thing because he saw the board clearly in Syria. We had beat ISIS, but what was on the other side of ISIS was the Assad regime that was backed by Russia, that was backed by Iran. And then on the other side, we had Turkey, who's a NATO ally who we need strategically just because of where they're located. They're the gateway to the southern belly of Europe. So by leaving our troops there, we were in a position where we could have gotten into a multiple-sided conflict with some major enemies for no real strategic gain. Like Eastern Syria is not strategic terrain in the grand scheme of things. It's not worth fighting and dying for us. The Russians think it is because of oil, and they eventually want to connect their navy to the Mediterranean ports that Syria has. So Russia wants to fight and die for it. So Trump saw that we would just get dragged down into this quagmire, and he tried to pull us out. Yeah. So that was the right thing. That was reinserting civilian leadership into the military, because for the previous almost 2 decades of war, we let the generals just decide exactly what was going to happen with the war. Bush and Obama both said, well, I'm just going to listen to the generals. That's good for tactical decisions, like how you go and destroy ISIS. But then we need civilian leadership to come in and say, hey, this is not what we signed up for, or hey, we've achieved our objective. Let's pull our forces out. Let's not fight this fight because it's not worth it. So I really appreciated President Trump's foreign policy leadership.
And there have been rumblings that Biden wants a foreign policy legacy, that he wants even perhaps more conflict, where he says it's necessary. and that he really prioritizes on the ground responses to things. That seems to be what he believes ends wars or ends conflicts. And you wrote that, or you put on your website, that you want to push our intelligence community to develop practical ways to combat terrorism without major troop deployments offensively and against new wars. That's something that the Republican Party sort of dances around a little bit. Other ways to end conflicts. How would you, as a member of Congress, bring that up more to the Republican caucus, or try to shift the Republican policy agenda? Because that's a real thing you could do in Congress, especially as a veteran.
The first part of that is repealing the authorization use of military force. So right now we've just essentially given a blank check or an easy button to presidents and to members of the Congress by saying, like, oh, the war is ongoing. And then that just puts all the weight on the DoD, and they have to go out and continue to fight these wars with no clear objective. So the first thing I think we need to do is say, hey, like, these wars as we know them are over. I understand that doesn't make threats go away, but then we need to actually have hearings and come up with new ways that we can address these threats. A lot of those will have to be closed door hearings, but we need to take all of our vulnerable troops off the battlefield, because we're the biggest power in the world. And when we remain overextended in places, we essentially create a market for all of our enemies to go pay people to attack us. And then we have to react. We have the ability to reach out and project force like no other country.
Right.
So we can essentially sit in places that we can't be hit, or it's less likely that we're going to be hit. And we can project forces to places that we need strategically. But then also we have great intelligence services. I spent some time in the CIA. Our men and women of that agency and others are amazing. And they can, from the shadows, they can affect a lot of these battlefields in these places. So especially in the Middle East, there's a lot of different competing groups that have local interests, and they can be played off each other essentially for our gain. We did this to great effect in the 80s against the Russians in Afghanistan. It worked out well for us. We didn't put any US boots on the ground. And through Title 50 covert action authorities, we helped bring down the Soviet Republic by paying Afghan proxies. So we have a long history of being able to, for a very little amount of risk and very little amount of blood and treasure, go into these places and affect an outcome. The military industrial complex doesn't like that, because it's relatively, it's pennies on the dollar compared to having multiple divisions deployed at a time. So there's a financial incentive to keeping the wars going on. And this opinion, the opinion that I have, would not be very popular, but I think these are conversations we need to have. And Congress has the ability to, they have the duty to declare war. And they also have the duty to say, hey, the war has extended its purpose and its date, and then also to use the power of the pocketbook of the budget as a means of accountability. So I think we need the legislature branch way more involved in one of its fundamental duties of declaring war.
And I think the Republican base and voter group would like to see more congressional involvement in this area. Presidents have too much ability to just unilaterally decide where everything is going outside of executive branch power. In your district, there's probably going to be a big focus on local issues as well. I know you've written a lot about fishing, and that's a very big industry where you live. Democrats really had a lot of power in local issues last time. They really ran on them. What are the local issues that you are hearing the most from, and that you're hearing the most about, and that you feel like are the most important for your district?
So, I mean, we talk about the America First issues and the voter integrity. So, like, I do hear that. Conventional wisdom told me, when I go talk to timber people, they have timber issues, and fishing people, they have fishing issues. They've all said election integrity. So,
Wow.
But the timber is huge, and fishing is huge. So the timber industry is the backbone of the Pacific Northwest. And for the last 20, 30 years, it has been absolutely gutted by excessive federal overreach. The federal government just straight up taking over land, and then saying that no forest management, no logging whatsoever can take place. And that's been done under the guise of the Environmental Protection Agency. But then also there's almost a cult-like religion out in the Pacific Northwest of the environmental movement. But what that's done is for one, it's killed a ton of jobs, and it's killed off a ton of small towns. So people just can't get jobs in their hometowns anymore, and they have to leave. So that's been horrible for the economy. But also, our forests have become extremely overgrown. We stopped logging in lots of them. So then we stopped cutting logging roads. We stopped cutting abilities for firefighters to respond and get to the heart of where a fire is as it starts. And so the last couple of summers up here, especially this last one, we saw large swaths of our forest just burn because they became literal timber boxes. Like our forests out here in the Pacific Northwest, most of them are technically rainforest because they get so much rain throughout the non-summer months, and they have very thick underbrush. So when we get a couple of dry months in the summer, it dries out. It takes one spark, and there's so much wood there, it just goes up. And then because there's no actual logging roads that go out to these places anymore, the firefighters are in react mode, and then all they can do is try and protect the communities. And by the time the fires get to the communities, it's almost too late. So it's an economic issue, to be sure, but it's also a huge safety issue. And talk about environment, like when our forests burn, our air quality was horrible here for months afterwards. So I mean, it's a full scale issue that we have right now. So what I think we need to do is we need to deregulate, get the EPA out of a lot of these federal lands, and let the private sector come back in. Because look, the private sector isn't just going to come in and slash and burn all of it, because that would be bad. Number one, these people are from here. They want to see the communities remain beautiful, remain healthy. But number two, it would be a financially really poor decision. So our logging industry understands how to do targeted and selective cuts that can keep the economy alive, but also aren't going to completely and totally deplete our forest, but then keep the healthy logging road infrastructure there that can also be used to respond to fires in the summer months. Fishing is a similar issue. We have major issues with our salmon runs. I think we need to get a lot of the federal regulation out of that, put federal dollars and grant money towards more fish hatcheries to increase the population of salmon that we actually can commercially fish and generate a good deal of money and income from. Another issue that we have off the coast of the entire Pacific Northwest, and to some degrees California, is Chinese fishing that happens in international waters. Right. So the Chinese fishing boats will come in and they will literally just hoover up as much sea life as they can. And they're not held to the same, they're held to no standard. If they can pull it out of the water and they can turn a profit from it, they're going to yank it out of the water. American fishermen at the same time have to go out there and abide by very strict rules. Otherwise, they're going to lose their business license. So we have to get the Chinese out of our waters and doing these extremely predatory fishing practices. So that's some place where the federal government definitely has some purview and can at least get, the predatory Chinese fishing fleets off of our West Coast.
I think that issue especially is important because there is this narrative that the only people who care about the environment are Democrats, and that there's no back and forth. We've interviewed another member of Congress who brought up the fact that, the Great Lakes are very important to him. And it sort of defeats the narrative that Republicans don't care about the environment. Do you think within Congress now there's enough focus on preserving the fishing rights and timber and dealing with making sure that there's not going to be this buildup that will cause wildfires? Or is the Republican Party not paying enough attention to it? Because I haven't heard it as much as I would think I would from candidates in this area.
No, I don't think so. I think the Republicans get really squishy on this because the Democrats will scream at them and say, you hate the environment.
Right.
And then they'll maybe say some things about the economy, but they don't ever tie the two together. And I feel like Republicans just get bullied on this issue because, like you said, the narrative is that Republicans, we just want to slash and burn the forests and pollute the oceans because all we want to do is make the big corporations rich. Well, it's completely the opposite. We want to preserve all these, and we want to find sustainable, reasonable ways that local people, local working class people can continue to make a living from these industries that their fathers and their grandfathers built for them. So I think it all goes back to the working class, and we just need to tie those two things together, how the environmental factor and the economic factor can work in harmony, and they have up until the last couple decades, really.
Yeah. And now switching just a little bit into your campaign strategy, you're running in a district that has been Republican for a long time. There seems to be an enthusiasm gap on Democrats that's rising and Republicans are lowering. What does your campaign strategy look like? Because I believe you're up against two other primary challengers and there's the one that's already in office. So how are you setting yourself apart from that pack of people?
So right now, I'm just trying to get out to as many events as I can. So I've been to all of our counties. I've met with the vast majority of our sheriffs. I've gotten to speak in front of most of our Republican committees from the different counties. They've all been very welcoming. And then any local community events that we have, I try and get out to. And I really like discussing the issues. I think a huge part of the America First style is that we talk issues and we let people know what our stances are. I really think people are tired of the well-polished politicians who say these great speeches that really mean nothing.
Right.
So I like to get out and really engage with people. So that's been my style. I do anytime an issue comes up, I try and at least do a video about it so people know what I would do if I were a congressman, because I consider this to be a job interview. I want people to get out there. I want them to ask me hard questions. I want to hear what matters to them. And then I want them to know what I'm thinking and what my values are. So constant engagement's been huge. obviously doing as much media as I can, trying to get out the word for fundraising, but really just trying to be in as many places as possible and hear from as many people in the district as possible. Because for far too long, Representative Butler, she kind of stopped doing public events. She's done some
Yeah.
phone-in town halls, but people out here have also told me that they're like, we don't feel heard. Like I've voted for this lady multiple times because she's a Republican and I'm worried about Democrats, but I've never heard from her and I have all these different issues and that's unacceptable. And I think that's unacceptable too. So I'm just trying to be accessible and out there.
And I know that you voted for her as well, so you definitely have some skin in this game. In terms of talking with sheriffs, that's been something that I haven't seen a lot of candidates talk about. Do you think that sheriffs have great power in the selection process in motivating people or their endorsement?
I think so. So we have some hero sheriffs out here in the 3rd Congressional District. So our governor, Jay Inslee, with his draconian COVID lockdowns, he has really pushed business owners and citizens pretty much to their limit. And we've had several sheriffs in our district that have stood up and said, I will not enforce Inslee's lockdowns or his mask mandates. And that courage is contagious. And that's inspired so many business owners to say, hey, I'm just going to open my doors and let free Americans make their own decisions. So I think getting their support and letting them know that I'm pro law enforcement. And from a federal perspective, I would do everything I can to support these courageous sheriffs and then also chiefs of police that have to stand up to Antifa, to BLM, or to a governor that's supposed to support them, but does nothing but try and lock their citizens down. So for me, law enforcement and supporting law enforcement is absolutely key.
And just sort of in closing, I know you're a parent to 2 small children. You're a single parent. What do you think as a parent is the issue that matters the most to you that would make you vote for somebody like you or would shift you maybe from being a moderate Democrat to being a Republican this election cycle?
So right now, I think just seeing how the Democrats have handled the COVID lockdowns and how they don't want to let go of that power and the power that we've given to governors and to teachers unions. We've kept our children out of school now. We're going back to like a half schedule right now in Washington, but with the talk of the 4th surge we've heard, and Joe Biden basically gave a green light yesterday when he said that he wanted to see the mask mandates come back and he wanted governors to enact those. All these activist governors like we have in Washington state, I mean, I know they heard that and they're all licking their chops for more authorities to lock people down. And the teachers unions hear that too. And they're like, oh, okay, we can continue to do what we did and drop full paychecks and not work. Right. So I think pushing the message that we're the party of liberty, as a parent, like I can't have my 5-year-old sit on Zoom. It just doesn't work. Right. It doesn't work for most adults. But yet my taxes haven't gone down. I'm still paying taxes. The teachers are still getting paid. So for me as a parent, I really want to see kids back in school and then the curriculum as well that's coming out of all these different organizations that have infiltrated our schools. The Planned Parenthood sex ed is absolutely disgusting and egregious. And that's infiltrated our schools kind of at every level. So I want to see a candidate who at the federal level, even though it's a state issue, would cut off federal funding. So I would cut off Department of Education funding as a congressman to education systems that are going to use critical race theory, 1619, Planned Parenthood, sex ed, because I want to see traditional values and just straight American history taught in our schools. So I think that's how we win over the parents. We're going to open the schools and we're going to teach your kids just traditional reading, writing, and arithmetic and keep the politics out of it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we need across the country to have less politics and education. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media to keep up to date with your race?
Yeah, so my website is joekentforcongress.com. There's links to all my different social media platforms. On Twitter, I'm Joe Kent 16 Jan 19. That's my Twitter handle. That's the anniversary of my wife getting killed in Syria. But joekentforcongress.com is the best place to follow my social media, read about my stances on the issues, and if they can, please make a donation.
Yeah, and we'll link all that below. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.